I think today we're kind of lingering a little bit more because we know this is our last Wednesday night. And I'll tell you a little story while we're waiting for everybody to settle out. So, Father Paul and I are lucky enough, blessed enough to have for our spiritual father, Yelena Amanthilokios Sukos, who's also known as the Metropolitan of New Zealand, and now the Metropolitan Archbishop of Ghana and Florida. That's a long thing to try to explain. But you know, the monastics, they have a tradition from the first day of Lent until, really the night before, until pre-sanctified liturgy, they don't eat anything. And they call it the first Pascha, because they're filled with joy from the pre-sanctified liturgy, and they break the fast, and it's a very joyous occasion. I can't thank you all enough for your attendance, for all the beautiful memories that your participation is bringing to me personally, because that particular joy is filling the room, and we can only thank the Holy Spirit for that. I want to thank our priests for being there for us. We just give them a little. It wasn't too long ago during COVID, we couldn't enter the church. Imagine if we didn't have priests. And I think in appreciation for priests, when we hear about our saint for today, Saint Iakovos Tsalikis, I think our appreciation for priests is going to grow. Today, I want to thank people who came from outside of our parish to be here with us. We have with us Mr. Kubarakis is here today. I also, is anybody here from St. George today? We almost always have someone from St. George. Bravo. Is anybody here from St. John? We have from St. John, we have a couple of people. Thank you so much for joining us again every time we see you. Anybody from Assumption? Anybody from Annunciation? Wow, there we go. Okay. I'm going to take a lunch. There's anybody here from Nativity, is there?
Hey, Nativity.
That's good. And is there a parish that I missed? Holy Cross.
St. Nicholas Ann Arbor.
St. Nicholas Ann Arbor? Okay. That's really good. This is our last Lenten lecture for the season. And I say it with a little bit of sadness again, because I know it's going to be another 3 seasons before we start this up again. But the work for this starts in October. So I'm going to take a little time to thank some people that I really want to. First of all, this Spiritual Life Committee, who there are 4 of them who have taken on a lot of the things that I was doing before, and I just really want to, I'm not going to say their names all now, but I just want you to know that there's other people who are working on this now. I want to thank our president for all the ways that she's coordinated between us and general parish. We want to thank the endowment fund, because without the endowment fund, there's people who are on the committee here without the endowment fund, we would not be able to put any of this on. And we are fortunate that we have a group in the endowment fund who believes in the mission of these lectures, and the role of it is adult catechism. So you all know that, in case you didn't know, you're all being catechized. Over every night, like after pre-sanctified liturgy, we finish this, I wake up in the morning, I have all these pithy things to say for next week, and I never think of them. But the one thing that keeps coming back is the thing that my grandmother said: you should be willing, we should be willing, when she was talking to me. You should be willing to wear out 40 pairs of steel shoes to get to one of these services, because the power and the benefit of these services is so profound. And I think you're all feeling it. And I don't want you to forget, I'm talking about it like this is the end, but next week we have the Palm Sunday luncheon. And we have an amazing speaker, and Jan isn't here yet, she's got a big thing going on at work. Jan Papadelis actually ran into our speaker on the way to California at the St. George Church in Albuquerque. He was speaking and she got to meet him. I thought she might be here tonight to say a few words, but I'm going to try to get Father Paul to get her to say something on Sunday so we can see if we can get more people to come to the Palm Sunday luncheon. Food is going to be great, and the lecture is going to be even better. So, and then I also want to thank Father Paul, who gives us the inspiration for the content. He decides the reading process, and believe it or not, we could have had 2 more lectures with the number of people that he knew who knew saints. It's a lot easier to do this in Greece because everybody in Greece knows a saint, right? But how do you find that here? We hardly have any relics compared to what they have in Greece, and really in all of European and Middle Eastern Orthodoxy. There's so many relics here. We have to really revere the few that we have. But I want to thank them so much. And this year, just like the talks about the icons, these lectures this year, and again, I'm thinking Father Paul still, have given people the feeling that they've encountered, that they've actually met the saint. And that is because just by talking about them, we bring them into the room with us. Just like being in front of the icons that we learned last year brings us into the presence of the saints, of the icon that is there. And so, so he asked us, when we were first talking about this, I'm like, hey, if I might go, we might have to call on you, but no. And I have to ask Father Paul, but before I could say anything, he goes, well, if you're going to do Saint Iakovos Tsalikis, I want that one. And we're like, okay. And then Father Paul met somebody who knew him. We're like, we've got to bring Mr. Isidoros. So you saw on the flyer that we had Mr. Isidoros. Tsalikis was supposed to be our speaker, but he got ill and couldn't travel. And so if we could just pray for him that his health improves, please. And if Mr. Tsalikis is watching, everyone here is doing the sign of the cross for you. So we also tried to get someone to come to talk to us about probably soon to be named Saint Ephraim of Arizona. And I know a lot of people want to hear about him, but it seemed like it wasn't the right time. We did a lot of looking around for people, but we might still be able to get it done before the end of the year. And with all of that said, I'm going to ask someone who needs no introduction, Father Michael, to come up and tell us about St. Iakovos.
It's nice to be back and see everyone. And a blessing to talk about St. Iakovos. Also, I'm putting on my recorder here. Also, can you hear me everywhere? Am I speaking loud enough? Okay. And also a challenge. It's a challenge to talk about anyone. If you think of who you know the best, try to describe them to someone who's never met them. You're not going to do it, right? But you can do your best. Well, I've never met St. Iakovos. I was excited to meet Mr. Isidoro, who had met him. But I do know many people who have met him. One being the previous metropolitan that I was under before we came back here. In Thessaloniki, the metropolitan of Thessaloniki had stepped down, and there were all these rumors, who's gonna take over, who's gonna take over. And I went to my village in the middle of the mountains, and someone goes, Chalkida in Evia, you'll find out that's sort of where St. Iakovos is from. η Chalkida βγάζει πολλούς επισκόπους. That Chalkida is putting out all the bishops. And that's true. So our bishop in Thessaloniki was from Chalkida, from Evia, where St. Iakovos spent most of his life. And also, the metropolitan of our own village, that village in the mountains, is also actually, he was from Evia as well, and they both knew and were formed by St. Iakovos. So we tend, as limited as we are, to sort of limit the impact that we can have on the world. But we see that when people give themselves to God, if it's His will, then it's really through what they say that with God all things are possible. And so even someone who lived piously on some quiet monastery on an island is still influencing people today and making the city put out bishops, if that's exactly what's happening. One other person, I'll just start with a quick story, because stories are always good, that knows St. Iakovos was the priest in my village who was about, he's in maybe 60. And I met him and he said, you know, I remember seeing St. Iakovos when I was like 17. And I looked at him and I said, you know, they say he's holy, but he might just be kind of wild and crazy. Wild and crazy, okay? And then he said, and then, you know, he became a saint, they started writing books about him, so I went and picked up the first book published about him, and I went to, and I grabbed the book, I was taking it out of the bag, and it fell down, fell open in a page, and I opened it up, and right in the middle of the page, it said, it was quoting St. Iakovos, some people think I'm wild and crazy. So, trying to get to know saints, get to know a person is difficult. I want to do it this way, if I can. I want to do one brush stroke that will just take us to have basically a picture of him from a bird's eye view. Sort of if you had to write his resume, what it would say on it. And then I want to go a little deeper and look at people who knew him and experienced him, what they said about him, what they were able to share. And then at the end, I'll close by just one thing that he said, hoping that it can help us. So, Saint Iakovos Tsalikis, you see various pictures just cycling through. They're a little blurry. You also have a picture there in front of you, hopefully, of Saint Iakovos. Saint Iakovos was born in 1920 in Livy Sea of Asia Minor. So, you know, the islands of Greece, some of them are quite far from Greece. One of them being, so Rhodes is about 60 miles from this place in Asia Minor, Livy Sea. Asia Minor, we say now, modern day Google Maps says Turkey, right? We're talking Asia Minor, Livy Sea, about 60 miles northeast of Rhodes, more east than north. And he was born there in 1920. Okay, so at the time, the Greeks, the Orthodox Christians were living in Turkey. Tensions had been there for a long time. Tensions were about to boil over, but there were still Greeks in that area at the time. He came from a family that was sort of well-known. They were known at the Patriarchate. They supported the local school, which was in Makri, is what it was called. And then, though, in 1922, so St. Iakovos was about a 2-year-old baby, his father gets taken by the Turks at that point and sent to what they call the Vathia Anatoli, to the deep east. And he's sent there, and because he was a mastoras, he was a worker, an engineer, something like that, he was put to work there. And not under great conditions, but he was put to work there. So his mother, St. Iakovos' mother now, has 3 children, St. Iakovos, and then she had 2 other children, and her husband is taken away. And so now she's living in their homeland, and we see she was actually born there. But she knows things are not going well, and so she takes her children and gets on a boat and leaves as a refugee. And they arrive to Piraeus, and then they first settle in Itaea in the Peloponneso, and they're there until 1925. So St. Iakovos is 5, his father's been gone for 3 years, his father comes back. Okay, so he was released from whatever it was, he's in Greece now, also as a refugee, he comes back, and then they move to Evia. Okay, and being a refugee wasn't easy, even though they were Greek-speaking and Christian, they were, for some of the mainland Greeks, others, and they were coming, they didn't have land, the Greeks had the land, and so they came, and initially in the Peloponnese, so they're sort of waiting, it's called the kliro, they're waiting to be given some piece of land so they can at least have some vegetables and eat. Well, they didn't get that, that was sort of an empty promise. Eventually the kliro opens from the Peloponnese on Evia. Now Evia, most people don't know this, is actually the second biggest island of Greece after Crete. And it's close. There's a bridge to mainland Greece. So if you look at a map, you might not even realize it's an island. Anyway, they go there, they go to North Evia, and that's where St. Iakovos spends his life. So, again, just bird's eye view, I have to stop myself from going into details. We'll get there. He lives in Evia, and he finishes Dimotiko, so he finishes school in 1933. So he's 13, his dad says, okay, no more school, you need to come help us work so we can live, because life was not easy. So they do that, and then when he's 18, the Metropolitan of Chalkida, which is the capital of Evia, ordains him a reader. So you've probably seen this happen here in our church, someone getting tonsured. I don't know how frequently it happens now. I remember when I was tonsured. So he's ordained a reader in 1938. 1942, when he's 22, his mother dies. 1947, he goes and serves in the army, so he's 27. 1949, his father dies, and St. Iakovos, we'll find out later, always wanted to be a priest. But his mother said, when she was dying, you have to make sure that your sister gets married. Right? Because at that time it wasn't so easy. So she had to have a klika, she had to have a good reputation to get married, a dowry. So anyway, so 1949, his father dies, he's sort of the head of the family, though he wants to be a monk, he sticks around until 1952 when he sees his sister married. Then right after that, he plans to go to Jerusalem, and there's a story here, to become a monk, because he had a relative, Theos Dimitrios, who had himself, though not proclaimed by the church, but had himself been sanctified, become a saint in the Holy Land at the temple of the resurrection there in the Holy Land. So he wanted to do that. He said, I'm going to follow my uncle's footsteps. This has always been in my heart. But anyway, for some reason, which we'll find out later, he stays on Evia, St. David's, on Evia. And so 1952, he goes to the monastery. About a month later, he's ordained a priest. And then he lives there as a monk/priest with 3 other sort of stable monks. So this wasn't like a huge monastery with a bunch of people in it. There were 3 other people, Gerondake, they were all older than him. And he's with them from 1952. 1975, he is made the abbot. Okay. So how old is he there? He's 55. 1991, so then he serves as abbot. 1991, so he's 71, is when he passes away, when he falls asleep in the Lord. Okay? So, bird's eye view. Who is St. Iakovos? St. Iakovos is just, and there's, if you know Greece, if you've been to Greece, he's nothing special from a bird's eye view. There are so many monasteries in so many villages, and there are so many that just have 1 or 2 people. And you sort of see people in general can look at these places and say, oh, there's just someone sort of keeping the door open, right? The Chorios, someone sort of built this place, and now someone's there and just keeping the doors open. So he's just a country bumpkin monk. That's all St. Iakovos is from the bird's eye view. Okay, nothing special. He's not a bishop. He's not a traveling priest that goes around and preaches. He's not an abbot on Mount Athos. He's an abbot of a monastery that was built in 1520, it was burned in 1830 by the, I think 1824, by the Turks. 1870 it eventually gets rebuilt after Greece gains its independence, and then but when he arrived there, it was really just nowhere to write home about. It would be maybe one of those monasteries, if you've only been watching the fancy monasteries, that you would go visit in Greece, and you'd say, oh, really, like, this is where we're sleeping? Like, the sheets, are there sheets? What are these other roommates we have that are not human? That sort of place. So that's what it was when he arrived there. So again, St. Iakovos, from a bird's eye view, is just a normal guy, just a country monk at some quiet monastery. Okay? Let's zoom in now. So this is layer 2. And this is going to be the biggest layer as far as time. So I'm going to talk about a few people who knew St. Iakovos. St. Iakovos, there's some really nice books written and speeches recorded from people like Elder Kyrios, who was the one who took over as abbot after St. Iakovos passed away. So he's spoken often about St. Iakovos. Elder Gabriel, who followed him, has also spoken a lot about St. Iakovos. Metropolitan Pavlos of Tsalikis, so this is up by like Kozani. Okay, he lived in this monastery for a long time and speaks about Father Iakovos. And then Metropolitan Neophytos, who's on Cyprus, knew St. Iakovos and speaks about him fairly often. So these are our sources, people who knew him. Okay, so let's go back. St. Iakovos, we said he was 2, and he leaves, and he goes to the Peloponneso. He's there for 3 years. But before they even get there, when they leave, just understand the family he came from. They leave Asia Minor as Greek Orthodox Christians, okay? And they know what they're doing. And they're very pious people. And his mother, we don't see this often now, but his mother really, you couldn't tell the difference between her and maybe a monastic. Of course, she was married, she had children, but her life was one of prayer. Constantly prayer and fasting, and it wasn't just her life, it was also the life of her sister. And these communities in Asia Minor who slowly were feeling the pressure, and always had the pressure to change, it wasn't so easy to be a Christian, we're generally very faithful. So they get on this boat, she's there with the 3 kids, they go to Piraeus, to the port in Athens, and she hears some workers swearing using the Virgin Mary's name, right? Vrizunti Panagia. So they're swearing using the Virgin Mary's name. And she says, it would be better if we turned around right now and we lived under the Turks, because we did not do this in our village. Just to show you the difference in the society that they came from as refugees to what they encountered, at least in Piraeus. Okay? Anyway, so they're there, and then we can go now to Evia, where he's living. His dad's finally back. You know, he's 5 years old. And he, from very young on, seemed to be interested in the church and liturgies. He took, because they were poor, he would take a broken piece of ceramic from a roof, and he would tie little strings around it and make the censer there. He would go around and he would sense the different churches, right? This is as a young boy. So from young, he loved it. Okay, then fast forward now, he's 18, he's tonsure reader. Okay, I remember when I was tonsure reader, at Assumption, didn't know what was happening, I was an altar boy, they cut the hair, there was a joke about what happens to the hair after, because we had just a bowl full of hair, and you know, I knew something. I knew this meant now that I could read in the church, but I didn't know what St. Iakovos knew, and I didn't do what St. Iakovos did. When St. Iakovos at 18 was tonsure reader, he essentially adopted from that moment on an ascetic life. Okay, ascetic, that means a life of spiritual struggle, fasting, prayer, vigil. So what do we mean? From that day on, he would eat on Saturday and Sunday only. Saturday and Sunday, from 18. Because he'd been conscious to reader, because he knew he was going to read in the church. He was that sensitive to the responsibility he had that he would fast 5 days of the week. And he started doing, we've seen Metanias, right? Where you do your cross and you go all the way down and all the way up. So at that age, he started doing 1,000 a night. So instead of sleeping, as an 18-year-old, he would do 1,000. Eventually, in his life, that number gets to 3,000. But my point here is not to be sort of impressed by the asceticism, but to be impressed by the spirit, by the serious manner in which he took the church and his relationship with it. It wasn't sort of a game, it wasn't a new role. If he was going to read in the church, he was going to be doing his best, not to be worthy, we're never worthy, but doing his best to respond to that responsibility from 18. Okay. He continues, he goes to the strato, he goes to the army, and people make fun of him because he's living such this strict and pious life. They call him either Iakovos, a silly or stupid Iakovos, or Padre Iakovos, Father Iakovos. So they're making fun of him. What are you going to do? You're going to be a priest? Okay, like, religion's good, I know, but you don't want to be too religious. Right? We of course hear that. Oh, my in-laws are super religious. Or, oh yeah, that guy's super religious. We don't want to do that. So anyway, that's what they were telling him in the army. Of course, they got to know him as well. So on the one hand, they're making fun of him. On the other hand, when one of them gets sick in the barracks, who's next to them praying on land? St. Iakovos. And then when he has his adia, his vacation, to go for a couple of days, leave the base, and go, he got it on Pascha because his leader was impressed by him. He liked him. And so he says, well, I know you love the church. You get your adia, your vacation on Pascha. Well, one of his comrades there said, you're going to go and you're going to go to church and say your prayers. What about me? I have a fiancé. Won't you let me go see her? And so he goes to the commander and he says, I don't want to go for Pascha. Though of course he did. And he says, give that, I want my brother here to go. And then he was stationed sort of on the mountains around Athens where they could hear the bells of Piraeus. And so then that holy weekend at Pascha, whenever he would hear the bells, he would go outside on the mountain and he would just sing any hymns he could remember and say any prayers he could remember from the service that day. Okay, so we're zooming in a little bit, right? We saw the boy, we know he's a refugee, stopped at 13 when he worked with his dad. He was tantric reader, he was a church kid. But we see, when we look in, someone already with a great sense of living for God, a great sense that this life has nice things, but the beauty we see here is just a glimpse of what's ahead. And so from young, he's deciding to shape his life, to respond and to move towards that beauty, okay? So that's him at 18. We'll first fast forward now, he marries his sister, and then he goes to the monastery. He said this is 1952, so he's 32, so he's been patient because he wanted to be a monk from a very young age, remember? And he wanted to go to Jerusalem because that's where his uncle had sanctified himself. So on the way to Jerusalem, though, because he was from Evia, he decides that he's going to go to stop at St. David Monastery, this little monastery in northern Evia. When he goes there, outside of the gates, and someone opens the door for him, an old monk. And he walks in, and he sees, they're described, he describes as palatia. The cells where the monks live seem to him to be so much like paradise, that they're like palaces. And he asked the old monk, the whole monastery is beautiful, you can see, the incense still in the air after the services, and he asked the monk, is there any palace here for me? The monk says, yes. Okay? And then the monk leaves, He goes into the church, and the other monks are in there, and they say, "Who let you in?" The gate was closed. He says, the monk, the father let me in. Who? It's just us here. And he looks over in the church, and he sees the icon of Saint David, who was the founder of the monastery, and later who it was dedicated to. And it was Saint David who let him in. And when he goes outside again, he realizes that what he'd seen, what a beautiful monastery he'd seen, wasn't what the monastery was then. That the monastery was actually in disrepair. That there were 3, like I said, aging monks left on some rock to take care of a big building, many buildings. But he'd been received by St. David, and he'd been told his palace is here. And so, well, he changes plans, right? And he stays there, and that's where he stays for the rest of his life. Okay, that monastery. So, his general program, 1952 to 1975, he was just a monk there. He was ordained about a month after. I forgot to say this. He was ordained as priest about a month after. And the bishop ordaining him told him, he said, "Iakovos, you will become a saint, and one day the church will recognize you." That happened in 2017. That's when that came true. He was ordained in 1952. Okay. But anyway, so he's there. What's his daily program? Okay, his daily program is this. At night, you have in your cell what's called a canon. Okay, a canon means, yes, you'll probably sleep a little bit, but it's your personal canon of prayer. So you'll have set prayers. You may do paraklesis. Probably when he did his 1,000 and then 2,000 and 3,000 metanias. He had his set prayers at night. 4:30 a.m., that's when everyone went to the church, and they started services. And they're in service for a while, because they do a midnight service, and then they do some hours, and then they do the orthros, and then they do liturgy. So longer than our Sunday morning, whole package. Probably about twice as long, okay, every morning. And then they go and they sit, sort of like we sat, and they'll have a koulouraki, some coffee, and then they go, and all day, manual labor, okay? They didn't have money. He was the youngest monk, so all day, manual labor, fixing the pathways, all of the, vegetation grows quickly in Greece, all of the trees, the gardening, all of that. That was on Father Iakovos. Manual labor, and then he goes to Vespers, okay? So just imagine today, had you woken up at 4:30, just to try to feel this, woken up at 4:30, okay? Then we go for 5 hours into church, and then we go and we have a koulouraki and some coffee, and so then around, we said 4:35 hours, so around 10 o'clock, you go out, and you work outside in Greek sun until about 7. Okay, and then as he got more and more responsibility, some of that work outside became times also that he would hear confessions. What Father can tell you is a different kind of work, but it's also work. And so he's hearing confessions, and then Vespers happens, and then Compline, it's like 7:30 p.m., then they might eat something. And then again, at the time he started hearing confessions, he'd have more confessions. Okay, so maybe he'd get to a cell at 12. So 4:30 he got to the church, 12 o'clock in the cell, he still has this whole canon to do, that's 4.5 hours. As he got more and more spiritual children, he'd get to a cell at 1 o'clock. So now he has 3.5 hours for his canon and to sleep. And more, 2 a.m., that's 2.5 hours. 3 a.m., and then eventually he would go right, for a number of years, he would go right into the services. So he wasn't sleeping. He's just hearing confessions. And of course there, we say, well, that's impossible. It's medically impossible. And it is medically impossible, right? But we say that because we don't so much have the immediate experience of God's grace that the saints do. And part of the reason that we don't have that, I'm saying this to myself, just so you know, is because we say things like it's medically impossible, because we don't have faith and just act. If there's an instance where we can do something out of love, we should just do it and not be afraid. Okay? If you're sure that it's love, then you will be okay. You will be okay. So anyway, that's his daily program for years and eventually decades. Okay? Saint Iakovos. Now, his as a confessor, I forgot to mention the cave. So the cave of St. David, the founder of the monastery, had a cave nearby, and he, St. Iakovos started going there at night to pray. So instead of his canon in his cell, which wasn't that luxurious. I think there's a picture of it at some point, but the picture is even fancier than it was when he was living in there. He just slept on boards. He had boards and a blanket he would sleep on the ground. Anyway, I guess he wanted, that was too comfortable, and he would fall asleep on it, and he preferred to be praying, whatever it was. So he started sneaking away to this cave that was quite a walk in the middle of the night, and it's not curated. So anyone been to camp? I know some people have been to camp. Our camp, there's sort of a curated walk through the woods, right? And while it can be unsettling, you know, like, okay, my counselors are in front, my counselors are in back, and there's no bears in these woods. Okay, his walk was uncurated. There were snakes, there were scorpions, there were other things you're hearing. He didn't have a cell phone, right, if he got hurt. And he would admit, from young, sort of a frightful person. He was easily made afraid. But anyway, he got up the courage, he would walk to this cave. But one night, as he's praying in this cave, I feel like my wife would not love this story. As he's praying in this cave, having walked there through the woods, being himself someone who's inclined to fear, he sees things hanging on the walls, maybe dropping from the walls, maybe crawling up the walls, and he realizes the cave is full of scorpions. It's full of scorpions. And he also realizes, because this is not what normally happens, that this is a temptation. So though he's afraid, he takes his walking stick and he draws a circle around him. And he says to the scorpions, "Fatene, fatene, eat me, I'm not leaving here." And he finished his prayer. And then he came back. Okay? Moments of trust in God. We see it from when he's young, we see it throughout his life. Let me get into miracles, okay? We could go on and on just about daily things like that. But I'll tell you miracles. So, Metropolitan Pavlos of their Baikozani, Siatistis, his first meeting with Father Iakovos, he was going there because the monastery was having its feast day. So he gets in a taxi cab and he goes up to see Father Iakovos, who he'd heard about, but really to go there for the Panegyria, it's the big festival. And the taxi driver starts telling him a story. So this miracle happened to the taxi driver. He says, "I was going once, there was a mom and her child, and the child was very sick. So they were taking the child and his clothes, this was a custom on the island at that time, for the monks to go read a prayer over them, over the child and over his clothes to help with the sickness." Okay. As they're going up, there's a place in the road that's sort of like one of those, you have to turn and go up at the same time and you're in a manual car. And so he said the taxi gets stuck. So it got stuck there. As they're waiting, they see a man coming down on a horse. It's Father Iakovos. He's coming on a horse. And they say, "Father, Father." And he says, "Don't talk to me. I have communion right now. I'm going to Danya, which is by the sea, about 8 kilometers away. I'm going to Danya. I'm going to commune someone. Let's not talk now." He keeps going. Okay? Well, let's go to the monastery anyway. They continue, they go to the monastery. And naturally, after they get in the gate, park the cab, the taxi driver went in with them because he was going to take them back as well. He goes into the gate, and they go into the central temple, the central temple of the monastery, and they light their candles. And then they see a priest come out of the altar, and it's Father Iakovos, who they just seen on the way to Danya. And the taxi driver goes, Father Iakovos, didn't you say you were going to commune someone? Yeah. Wasn't Danya, weren't you going to Danya? Yeah. Well, aren't you going to commune them? I did commune them. How did that happen? And he said, those are God's things. So, I don't know. It's simply, that's God's stuff. Okay. So that was this metropolitan, how he met him. He ends up staying with St. Iakovos. You can see him in one of these pictures. He almost looks like St. Iakovos, but with a darker beard. There's one of them standing together. That was his first meeting with St. Iakovos. And another couple stories here. There's a miracle that happened with his niece. His niece was pregnant, and she was it was time to give birth, and the doctor said, if this baby isn't here by Saturday, you need to come to the clinic. This is in the hospital. Come to the clinic on Saturday if you're not in labor, if you haven't given birth. So Friday night at 10 p.m., they hear a knock on the door. The baby has not yet come, and it's Father Iakovos, and he's holding the hand of St. David, the saint of the monastery. And this is shocking to them, because he never even visits at a normal time. He's at the monastery. He's not out sort of visiting family in the middle of the day even, or at a normal time. So why is he here at 10 p.m.? And he doesn't talk to his niece, he talks to his nephew who had married her. He takes him aside and says, tomorrow you're going to go through something very difficult. But don't worry, St. Iakovos is with you. Or St. David, sorry. St. David is with you. So they go to the hospital, and she's taken in by the doctors, and, well, I don't want to make that. I was going to say, as a man, you know how sort of scary that is, but of course, the women are having to scare. I'm not going to say that. But they take her, and the doctor comes out. So he's an experienced doctor. He's many decades as a doctor in this hospital. And he comes out, and he says, you're going to have to make a decision. Do you want Maria, your wife, or do you want the baby? And he doesn't know what to do. And he says, Maria. I want Maria at all costs. So he goes back in. That was a difficult moment. He goes back in, and then he comes out shaking and weeping, the doctor. Says, I have never seen God's hand so alive in all my decades as a doctor. The cord was wrapped around the baby's head. It was not going to live. And it just unraveled like I've never seen from the baby. And the baby lived. Okay, so it may seem small to us, but just that comfort that St. Iakovos, of course, knew what was going to happen, but that he comforted there and brought the relic to his niece. There's many stories after his death. In 2012, they had 300 stories of things of people who had prayed to St. Iakovos after his death, and miracles that had happened. For example, even at his funeral, there was a priest there who had a tumor on his hand, and he touched it on the casket, and he said, Father Iakovos, not St. Iakovos, is that right? Just Father Iakovos, please help me. And the tumor disappeared. There was another priest who was on Cyprus but knew of Father Iakovos, and he said to a visiting bishop, he said, please bring me some oil from the candle at his tomb, because he for 40 years has had hemorrhaging. And the priest, the bishop says, okay, I'll bring you the oil, and he brings him the oil, and the guy meets him at the airport, the priest meets him at the airport, instead of at the church or the next day like they arranged. He says, give me the oil, anoint me. And then he just leaves. And then a couple hours later he calls him and says the bleeding stopped. And it hasn't returned. So there's many miracles like that. I'll tell you now, again, to help us sort of get a little closer, about Metropolitan Morpho, Metropolitan Neophytos. He's on Cyprus, but he had an interesting experience of meeting St. Iakovos. Okay, so he went to Athens. He was in a family in Cyprus in 1974, where there was an invasion. People were kicked out of their homes. You know, probably that there's part of Cyprus that is, in Greek eyes, that is occupied, that were Greek homes, and they were kicked out. And so he was part of that, and his brother fought in the war, and his brother died just a week after the war while he was sort of still active in the army. And because of that, it meant that one of the children of that family, there was a law at the time, if one of your children is killed in this conflict, one of your other children does not have to serve in the army. So this young man, Neophytos, we know him as now, his name was Homer, Homeros. This young man is exempt from army service, so at 17 and a half he goes to Athens. First year, he says he's studying law, he's sort of in worldly pareas, worldly groups of friends, he's just having a nice time there. The second year, he remembers that his brother had told him, you should always hang out with people who are better than you. So he started finding some friends who were going to the local church of St. Gerasimos down where he was studying. And so he starts going to that church, starts to see how they're living. They talk about things like confession, spiritual father. And so he says, you know, I want a spiritual father, but I want one like the old priests that I knew on Cyprus. I don't want a theologian with many degrees. I want a simple person of prayer, a simple person whose life was been formed by the altar, right, rather than books. And so everyone at that time in Athens was telling him, well, you should go to St. Porphyrios, Father Porphyrios, no one here, he was well known. So he goes to Father Porphyrios, who we now know as Saint Porphyrios. He goes to meet him, and he tells him, you know, after talking, there was some things that made an impression in their own discussion, but after talking to St. Porphyrios, he says, will you be my spiritual father? And he says, no. He says, you don't need a teacher, you don't need someone who can sort of teach about orthodoxy. He says, you're an orphan. You need a father. You need a father. You need to go to Evia, and he says, to the humblest, most secret saint that Greece has, Father Iakovos. Okay, so he's in Athens, he hears St. Porphyrios, who had already showed in their own conversation some of his gifts of the Holy Spirit. He says, go to Evia, you'll find your father there. Now, this Homer at the time had heard of Father Iakovos on Evia, but he just heard, sort of like what I said, on Evia there's a monastery, and it's sort of a country bumpkin monk there who talks to the icons like they're people. He talks to the icons, he goes and he says, why aren't you doing this for me? You know, every day I light your candle, and I'm not going to light your candle tomorrow if you don't help this poor mother with her problem. A simple approach. So he goes there to the monastery. That's sort of what he's expecting, so whatever we can imagine, that's what he's expecting to meet. He goes there, it's Holy Week, it's before Pascha, and he goes and gets there at Vespers, and he sees Father Iakovos in service, and it's the total opposite of what he'd been waiting to see. That he saw a man that looked like an icon had been peeled off the wall. His eyes were down, and when he walked, it was as if he was walking on cotton. He was silent, focused in prayer. It was like an angel in the church. So he's nervous to approach him. He goes and he tells him, you know, I'm here, Father Porphyrios sent me, and could I stay? Because at that time you could only stay at the monastery for 2 days, 2 nights. That was how long you were allowed to stay at a time. So can we make an exception so I can stay at Pascha? So this is in the church, right? You just come to Vespers. We've all been to Vespers, we've all seen the priest. He goes up, he asks him this. And St. Iakovos says, what are you saying? He says, we are going to do many Paschas together and many Christmases together. So he from there tells him, sort of, I'm taking you under my wing. The next day, he calls him to his cell. He calls him to his cell, and Homer wants to confess. So he goes in for confession, and as he's confessing, Father Iakovos says, what did you say your name again? It was Homer. Oh, okay. He keeps on confessing. what was your name again? Are you sure that's your name? Homer. Yeah. And why would I be lying during confession? My name is Homer. Yeah. Okay, I just see something different, he says. I see something different. And then he goes, they should have named you Mirona. So we have to know some Greek here. Homer in Greek is Omiros. Okay? It's not a Christian name. Mirona in Greek is a Christian name. Omiros and Mirona are very close, especially if you're talking. So Mirona, Omire, they sound close together. Okay? At Homer's baptism, his yaya was named Mirofora. Okay, sort of the girl version of Mirona. And at the baptism, he remembers there being a commotion where they said, well, we want to name him after the yaya, because she hadn't had someone named after her. And they couldn't figure out what name. There was commotion of what name to name him. So they named him Omiron, thinking that was the male equivalent of Mirofora, his yaya. What Father Iakovos was saying was actually the male equivalent, Mirona, the Christian name of it. Okay? And then he says to him, it doesn't matter though, you're going to change your name anyway. Okay? So what's that mean? But he's a law student. Okay? When do adults change their names sort of in the Orthodox world? If they're tonsured, if they're ordained, that's when you change your name. At the end, remember this story is by Metropolitan Iakovos of Cyprus. At the end, he reads the service of forgiveness, and he says, forgive the sins of the servant of God, Neophytos. He says the name that he ends up getting at his ordination. Okay, so that was day one. That was day one of his, well, day two, right? He met him in the night, meets him the next day. The next day, Father Iakovos calls him again to talk to him. And he says, Omire, we have more we have to talk about. What do you mean? He says, you have bitterness in your heart. And that took him off guard. It's a bit confrontational. But he did. You know, he said, I was orphaned at 8. And when I was 12, I lost my homeland. I lost my house. I was kicked out right in the invasion. And I lost my brother. How would I not be bitter? How would I not be bitter? And Father Iakovos tells him, for everything that happens, God has a reason. I don't know the reason, but I'll pray. And so then Homer goes on his way. He goes to Spetses, a nearby island, and he works there in the summer. And having been impressed by Father Iakovos, he sends some of his friends, his fellow waiters and waitresses, to go see him in Evia. At some point, Father Iakovos says to his friends, he says, go get Homer from Spetses. Tell him I have to see him. I have something to tell him. And so they go and they tell Homer to go, and he goes. And he goes and he sees Father Iakovos, and they're in the cell. And he says, Father Iakovos says, I prayed. And God helped me understand what happened. He said, was your brother ever in love with a Jewish woman? And he says, yeah. In fact, he lived in Israel for 2 years. He said, your brother was going to marry the Jewish woman. You were going to become Jewish. Your brother was going to become Jewish. You were going to move to Israel. And your mother would have been heartbroken. Remember what mother this is, how much love she had for Christ. And so, and as a Christian, your mother would have been heartbroken. Said, your brother, when he was 24, was a very, very good man. Very, very good man. Maybe better than you understand. And God took him there. And now he rejoices in heaven with Christ. And you are a priest. Or no, you aren't a priest. You will be a priest. And you will rejoice at the altar. And your mother will rejoice for both of you. Now, that story can be sort of shocking for us and sometimes even uncomfortable. Because the reality is, you and I, usually, difficult things, we don't have the answers. And like as a priest I do, it would be very bold for me to try to make up a reason for something like a tragedy. We don't know. But Father Iakovos and the Bishop Iakovos says this now. He said, Father Iakovos really was a father to me then, because he took something that was keeping me from Christ, that was holding my heart captive, and God had shared with him, because he was sincere in his prayer, God had shared with him something that freed me and allowed me then to grow closer to God, to walk a spiritual path, and the path that he remains on. He's a bishop now. So these are gifts. These are gifts of the saints. They show the power of God, and they can transform lives. And that's why you've heard about many saints. That's why we know that me, you. Can we transform someone's life? Slowly over time, maybe our children, we can exert some influence in the face of their free will and who God made them to be. Saints, though, can sometimes change people's lives in a moment. And that's because God's the one acting there. God's the one acting there. Okay. So now let's just look at Father Iakovos' last days and funeral. So he goes to the monastery, 1991, and one day he gets up and he goes to the liturgy. He's old now and he's been having heart problems. Goes to the liturgy, hears confessions, he received communion. He's waiting for an Athonite monk to come who was his spiritual son, because that Athonite monk his name was Father Hilarion, was going to be ordained in Evia the next day. He talks to him before and he says, you're coming to Evia to be ordained and also to dress me. And so the young monk doesn't know what that means. What's he talking about? Well, dressing, if you've ever been to a clergyman's funeral, the clergyman in the funeral home is vested. And so priests and deacons, especially like in Greece, it would be deacons who do the vesting. They'll put the vestments on the body of the person who's passed away. So he says to this monk who's coming, you're coming to dress me. Okay? And then he hears a confession of, and this is sort of an eyewitness account, of one of his spiritual children named Gerasimia. And Gerasimia is there in confession at some point. And Iakovos, remember he's old now, older, he's 71, but with problems. And he covers his eyes and he says, the Virgin Mary and St. John and St. David have come to the monastery. She said, well, why have they come? They've come to take me with them. Okay. At that moment, they returned from the ordination. So his spiritual son from Monathos was now a deacon. He was no longer just a monk. He was a monk and a deacon. So the fathers, the deacon and the bishop who did the ordination and other fathers returned, and they knock on the door of the cell. And he tries to get up, and he can't, so he sort of falls down there. And they open the door, and he sees them. That deacon, he said, would dress him. They all rush over to him, and he breathes 3 times. So the person who was there said 3 times, and gives up his spirit. So he foreknew what would happen. Very clear what was going to happen. And then, the funeral, they didn't really tell anyone about. Word got out, and I'm just saying this because it's worth looking up on YouTube. It's on YouTube. The funeral, they couldn't do it inside the church because so many people showed up. So they end up taking him outside of the church into the monastery courtyard to do the funeral. Okay? It's quite impressive. They have a clip. People are in the bell tower. They've climbed up into the bell tower of that ladder to be able to watch the funeral. It's a it's a sea of people. And as the funeral service is over, what they do is, it's a little different than like what we're used to seeing. He's in a very simple wooden stretcher almost. He's in his vestments, and there's a sheet that he's laying on. So they lift up the edges of the sheet and they fill it with flowers. Okay, and then they close it. right when they close it, you can hear it if you listen to the video. You hear someone go, Agios, saint. From close. Agios, saint. And you start to hear the ripple going. And what's amazing is the ripple is not loudest near the camera. It gets louder and louder, and everyone at the funeral ends up shouting, saint, saint, saint. So these people, and often with holiness, you're surprised by it. They might not have known it, but at that moment, they might have all together sort of realized what they had and what they'd lost, at least in their perception of loss. Okay, so that's St. Iakovos from a little bit more up close. Now, it's late, and so I'm going to say this. Saints, I'm closing now, I'm on the third layer, which is St. Iakovos' own words. Saints become saints in secret. Okay? Their lives, that thing that makes them different than us, is not sort of how they're born or their potential. It's what they did. But what they did that makes them different than us, they keep hidden. They need to. God says it in the gospel. It says, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing. That's for our own sake, so we don't get proud. He also says, pray to your Father who is in secret. And he says, don't do your good deeds before men, right? You already have your reward. So these people who love God, they become saints. Their holiness happens in hidden moments. The hidden moments where they are alone with God. Either alone or surrounded by people, but in their hearts, they're with God. That's where holiness happens. And so we don't know all of the secrets. And every once in a while, they speak because they love us, because they love God. And we get a little nugget. And so I chose a nugget here, and I have it there on your pictures. One small quote from St. Iakovos. It said, we are not sanctified by the place in which we live, but by the way in which we live. Because, remember, St. Iakovos' goal originally was to go to Jerusalem, to become a monk there. And he stops at sort of the last place you might have expected to become a monk. And he chooses there to live for God. And he lived there for 39 years as a candle burning for God. That's all he is. He loves God. Because he loves God, he loves his brother and sister. And that's how he lives. That's how he lives. And so I thought this is good for us to hear sort of at the end of the lecture series, because you've heard of many saints now, and many examples of holiness. And they're all sort of different from each other, their circumstances. Some were in Greece, some were not, some were in Romania, some came to America. And yet, they all were able to love God with all their heart, mind, and soul. They were all able to get to that point where they no longer live, but Christ lives in them. And so, we are not sanctified by the place in which we live, but by the way in which we live. So I just want to say to all of you, and I said this on Monday at a retreat, they'd asked St. Porphyrios how long it takes for someone to become a saint. He said 3 days. 3 days. So, I'm going to say to all of you, don't look outside of your lives for moments where you can show your love for God. Don't look outside of your lives for moments where you can pursue holiness. Okay? It's not in a different place. It's not with different people. It's not with a different job. It's not with a different marital status or status of children and no children. It's not in any of that. Right here, where you are, is where you can be sanctified. So I pray that all of the saints and holy examples you've heard can inspire you to understand what it takes to become a saint. Not because they tell us, because they don't tell us, but because you are doing it yourself. It's the only way. So God bless you.
if you're like me right now, I'm feeling very refreshed. I didn't even notice the time go by. I just want to, if somebody has a burning question, one or two questions, that Father Michael can answer, then let's just have a couple more announcements, and then of course we can go. Does anybody have a question for Father Michael? Everybody good?
They have my cell phone.
Was that,
They have my
okay,
cell
he said, oh, George has one question.
No, I have a comment.
Oh, a comment.
I read in his biography that he prophesied that Patriarch Bartholomew would be thrown
Oh, he
before it was decided.
before it was decided, he prophesied that Patriarch Bartholomew was going to be enthroned Patriarch of Constantinople. Did you say, you know, that's great. Okay, guys. Well, thank you all. That's my son. If anybody wonders if I sound like I'm being quick with a really, that's for family. A couple of things. First of all, one very big special thank you to the young adults in Iakovos for our education. And if anybody wants to stop by the bookstore, Katina says she'll open it. I think we have some books on St. Iakovos. We definitely have a children's book on St. Iakovos if you want to get something for your kids. And the last announcement, we have 2 garbage cans. So if you could please take your trash to one of the garbage cans before we come. And Father Paul, do you have anything you want to say before we? Oh. There's also going to be carry-out boxes for the extra food roll-ups.
And again, a thank you to the young adults and the EPA for sponsoring for this meal and serving. And to our Greek Council, Mr. Koubarakis, thank you so much for coming and making our evenings don't forget the Greek parade is this Sunday. Let's stand and then, Adam, if you don't mind coming to help me, we have to sing Kyrie ton Dynamion, Lord of the Powers, in Greek and English. You know I don't read that. I don't know how to read Greek music.
Lord of the powers, be with us, for in times of distress we have no other help but thee, Lord of the powers, have mercy on us. Kyrie ton dinameon, Bethimonielu, adon carectos uvoiton, entrixes sinuque onen, Kyrie ton dinameon, eleison imas.
We do want to see you on the Palm Sunday luncheon. I don't want to forget to remind you about that. Please sign up. Kalispera says, Kalirika says.
Take us off.